I do want to get to this because President Trump did just tweet, and here's what he had to say. We'll be speaking with Germany and France this morning. And this is after, of course, he spoke with the leaders of Japan and China last night about the North Korea situation. Heather, I want to get your take on what the Undersecretary Burns was just talking about, about Trump not being tough enough with Putin and on Russia in terms of the Ukraine sanctions and the Senate sanctions that were voted here in the U.S.
I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Trump's entire MO is to do a dance where he's tough and then he comes back, and he's tough and then he's nice. It's very calculated. I mean, this is one of the things that was in the election that you could see. He's not emotionally driven when the claim is that this is all thin skin. But if you're a thin-skinned person, you can't pivot as quickly as he pivots between being attacking and being nice and gracious and conciliatory. And I think that what we're seeing here with Putin is a big dance. We need Russia on some things. We're annoyed with them about others, and he is feeling his way two strong men sort of figuring out, you know, they both have a lot of the same affect, and they're feeling each other out. So
can we talk a little bit about Syria? I'd like to hear the ambassador's views.
Well, I was going to point out, if you're going to talk about President Trump and this administration looking or behaving in a weak manner on Russia, the fact that we struck that Syrian air base is the very opposite of that in terms of Russia and Iran.
And that's what I'm wondering is whether there's any room for agreement or collaboration with Putin on the Syria problem.
Nicholas?
I would say probably not. I think I supported President Trump's airstrike on the Syrian base 6 weeks ago, but the Russians are aligned with Iran and Hezbollah, and right now they're trying to win a major victory that doesn't really leave a lot of room for the United States to cooperate. But let me just say on the question of whether President Trump has been tough enough, we know that Putin launched a cyber attack on our elections. We know he tried to get into 21 states' databases on voters. We know the Senate Republicans want to sanction Russia over that, and President Trump hasn't agreed. I testified before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence just 3 days ago, Wednesday, and the Republicans and Democrats are united saying that the United States needs to be tougher on Russia and show the Russians they can't interfere in our elections. I don't understand the argument that somehow this is some kind of a dance. Look at the facts. The president hasn't been tough enough on Ukraine or on the Russian interference. And I think that's got people Nicholas, on the Republican side concerned.
I think that the Democrats also have a very big problem in terms of the lack of action last year by the Obama administration, because if you look at a timeline of the cyber attacks, you had the DNC wouldn't turn over its server to the FBI, who was trying to investigate it. The Department of Homeland Security issued a statement in August that they were trying to hack the state voter registration systems. President Obama got in Putin's face in September. There's a lot of pressure on both sides at this point for the lack of action last year and then whatever inaction you're talking about this year. But speaking of the former president, I want to bring up this. Former President Obama will meet with South Korean leaders today. This comes after President Trump spoke on the phone with the leaders of China and Japan last night about increasing pressure on Kim Jong-un and the regime there. What is your reaction to President Obama, the former president, speaking with world leaders?
Well, that happens all the time. I worked for both Republican and Democrat presidents going back to Jimmy Carter in their administrations. And former presidents travel, they meet world leaders. Generally, the accepted practice is that the ex-president will keep the State Department or White House informed of what he's hearing or what he's saying. So there's nothing unusual about that. And I did testify last week. I think that President Obama should have acted much more quickly and resolutely when the cyber attack happened. But the fact is, he did sanction Russia, and he did have a one-on-one conversation with Putin where he told Putin that that can't happen again. I think that's the challenge for President Trump at this summit meeting in Hamburg, Germany, the G20 summit. When he meets Putin, he's got to show that he has a plan, because he hasn't showed that yet, and Congress is concerned, and not just the Democrats, but the Republicans as well.
I want to get to this. President Obama has reportedly held meetings with lawmakers and the chair of the Democratic National Committee, according to reporting by The Hill. What do you think about him taking a role now in reshaping the Democratic Party? Because I will point out that President Obama, because we keep talking about Trump hammering the media, President Obama, after the loss, said part of it is Fox News in every bar and restaurant in big chunks of the country. He blamed Fox News for the loss of the Democrats last November. So I just wanted to point that out, because President Obama hammered Fox News repeatedly during his 8 years in office. So he did it differently, but he was still criticizing the media. But I want to get your reaction to President Obama being more involved in kind of Democratic strategy, if you will.
Well, you know, he ran two brilliant presidential campaigns in 2008 and 12, and so I don't know to the extent to which he wants to be involved or will be, but he's certainly someone with a lot of experience. It wouldn't be unusual, for instance, if the Republican Party turned to George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush in the past when they were out of office for advice. I think this happens all the time in American politics, but as a citizen, I think that our political leaders ought to respect the press, both Fox News but also MSNBC, and the First Amendment responsibilities that the press have. And I think one of the mistakes that President Trump has made is that he's vilified the press unnecessarily and really brutally, and it diminishes the confidence that people have in a very important institution. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir because you're all members of the press, or at least some of you are. But we've got to have much greater respect for the press across the board, whether it's conservative or liberal.
Well, I've got a thicker skin than people who work at some of these other networks, clearly, because it just wouldn't bother me. And this is my opinion. President Trump is expressing how people at home feel about
But also, let's remember during this last campaign, the press stopped acting like the press. The press decided that because it was Trump, they had a moral obligation to do something different and to sort of set aside journalistic standards, and a lot of them have now become pretty extreme in their own language. You've got the New York Times that's sort of gone off the journalistic rails. The Washington Post has done the same thing. This is not Trump doing it to them. They did this to themselves, and he is capturing a public zeitgeist that has had it with journalists who've stopped being objective.
The polls don't show that. The facts are that most Americans understand. The polls don't show that. The facts are that most Americans understand the press is important. And, you know, to attack the press unnecessarily, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you could make the same argument about Fox News, that Fox is biased, that Fox has a conservative bias. I don't make that. I come on Fox to talk. But we've got to step back and try to preserve our country and the decency in politics and not vilify people because they're on the left or the right.
Well, Nicholas, good to see you. I'll just say that people who work in politics, they like to stab you in the back, and people are just shocked that they actually have somebody now who is willing to verbally stab somebody from the front. That's how I'll phrase it.
But to denigrate women, to denigrate Mika Brzezinski, to say those outrageous things, it was un-American. People reacted very, very harshly about that.
Two-way street.
It was a mistake by
Nicholas
President
Burns,
Trump.
Thank you.